Welcome back to another episode of Property Now, where we are on a mission to make you the property pro in your group chat. Today I am joined, as always, by my excellent panel of co-workers and co-hosts, Michael, Chris and Jason. And we dig into what I think is going to be part one of a many-part discussion around the generational divide in terms of the housing crisis in Australia. It's a great conversation and we can't wait to hear your thoughts on it. Make sure you subscribe and follow Property Now. Welcome back, guys. Did you miss me last week?
100%. 100%.
I missed you.
I think it's welcome back to you.
Yeah, that's true.
I think the whole audience missed you. All the feedback was Jason's voice too sexy. Zaz, just not listening
Where
to
is
it
she?
anymore.
Yeah, you could only keep me out of here for 1 week. I'm back.
Welcome.
Welcome back.
Feeling good and ready to talk about the generational divide when it comes to property. So this topic, we actually did speak about it. I think it was back in episode 1, maybe, very briefly. We talked about the generational wars on TikTok. I think it was you, Michael, that brought that up originally, and how there's always that sort of debate over, who had it harder to buy property, this and that. It's a big conversation. It's very nuanced, and we're going to tackle one side of it today. So the catalyst for this convo, and I want to quickly sort of set up a bit of a timeline, give a bit of context as to why we're talking about it today. So bear with me. So 2 weeks ago, I read an article in the Sydney Morning Herald by one of their editors, and it was titled "The Sydney Suburbs with the Most Spare Bedrooms." And I thought, well, that's a pretty interesting article. So I had a little read. And essentially what it was talking about is that there's a significant number of baby boomers in Sydney's middle ring suburbs. I didn't know what middle ring meant at the time. So for our listeners, if you also don't know, middle ring is 5 to 10 kilometres from a CBD. That's correct? Yeah.
I have no idea.
You're telling
Okay,
us,
great.
yeah.
Yes. Yes.
All I know is Greater Sydney
Yeah, cool. That probably fits the bill
from the
too.
COVID days.
Oh, it's so good to know something that you guys don't know for once. Yay. Okay, so yeah, it was basically calling out baby boomers and saying these are the suburbs where there are people living and they have at least 2 spare bedrooms. And the whole, I guess, gist of the article was that if these people downsized, it would be a significant step, this is the opinion of the editor, in solving our housing crisis in Sydney in particular. And I imagine it's probably fairly applicable to other, capital cities around Australia.
How did baby boomers respond to that article?
Well, so they posted this article on Facebook, as they do.
I'm sure it was very positive. They agreed. They'll start selling their houses today.
That's a great
There's a
idea.
big surge of listings.
So, no, it did not go down that way, unsurprisingly, I think. So they posted this on Facebook, and the Facebook post had so many comments, and I did a little bit of digging to see how many comments did the Sydney Morning Herald normally get, to give me a bit of context. Normally it's like 8 to 10 on a,
Comments.
on like a given, article.
How many did this have?
Like 1,300.
Wow.
Very,
1,300.
very quickly. Yes.
Did you read all of them?
No, I think I just did like most relevant or something, like, and it brings up the ones that have the most likes. So it's probably a little skewed because I'm sure I was looking at the ones that are the most, controversial, the most like provocative, but no surprises. Baby boomers were pretty unhappy about this article.
Yeah.
Thinking, why is it my fault? Why should I have to move? I've worked hard my whole life, like all those sorts of things that I think make a lot of sense. And I'm sure I would feel this exact same way if I was in their position. So that's the first part. And then 2 days later, another article comes out, also from the Sydney Morning Herald, but from 2 different editors. And it was very much a response to that initial piece. They actually cited at the start of this second article, we had such a large volume of letters, emails, and social media comments about this first piece. So this is what we're writing kind of in acknowledgement of that, which I thought was quite interesting. I felt like I was like,
So they responded
seeing
to
all
their
this
own
drama.
article?
Yeah.
It's cool that you wouldn't see one medium giving both sides of the argument. So that's like hats off to SMH for that.
Different journo?
Different, yes. Yeah.
Do we know? I don't know if we know this. Did we know how old the journos were? Like, are they?
I was thinking the same thing.
I think the first one was she'd be like millennial.
Okay.
Fitzsimons or Fitzsimmons. I don't
Fitzsimmons,
know.
yeah.
But I don't know about the other 2. But it's
Me
just
either.
interesting because like when we're at generational wars with each other, we're gonna be on our generation's side usually.
100%.
So interesting to know who that was. But.
Yeah, well, that I do not know, but we can definitely look into that after this and maybe drop it in the show notes or something, because I think that is interesting to know what like context they're coming
Their
from.
perspective.
Yeah. But so that article had some pretty strong language, I thought, in saying that headline was, blaming baby boomers for your money woes is unfair, lazy and wrong. So it was an opinion piece, and I thought, that language is pretty strong. And I thought that article was super interesting. Like I think it did, cause me to reflect a little bit and like think about my reaction to that first piece and then, this new perspective. So that essentially is the, top line of these two articles. And I thought it brought up a very interesting point of, are we misplacing blame when it comes to the housing crisis that we are facing across the country? I think it's very easy to point the finger, especially when you can sort of look at a generation or a group and say, oh, well, you're doing this and the media is telling me that makes it harder for me, so I'm going to blame you, rather than looking at the bigger picture. And it raised a lot of questions around policy and other solutions. So that is the context to kind of kick us off.
So did the second article change your original opinion? What was your original opinion when you read the first piece that came out?
Yeah, well, I think I was reading it and going, yeah, it does seem really silly. And not even just in the context of me wanting to be able to buy a house closer to the city, closer to where I work and where my friends are, where my family is and where good amenities and all that sort of stuff is. I don't necessarily think that a couple in their 70s selling their house within 5 k's of the city is going to help me be able to get into the market, because probably I'm not going to be able to afford their house. That's not going to help me. But I think, I was kind of having the perspective of like, oh, there's so many people dealing with homelessness or other things, that like, yeah, there are these houses that are sitting not vacant, but, there's all these rooms. So like, is that part of the solution? Maybe I thought, there is some way that people downsizing into something that is more suitable for their needs at whatever stage of life they're in would help. So that was kind of what I was thinking originally. And then when I read the second article, it made me think, okay, well, hang on. If this was my grandparents, if someone was staring at my grandparents telling them to up and leave their house that they've been in for, 40 years and where they've built a life, and I would say respectfully, piss off and leave my beautiful grandparents alone. So I liked that I was, thinking a bit deeper about it and thinking, hang on, it's actually not any generation's fault. There's a lot, there's bigger things at play here. And like, it's the government's fault.
So you called your grandparents to apologise, obviously, for trying to kick it out.
Yeah, I was like, never sell your house.
Never sell.
Don't listen to them.
I'm so sorry.
I'm so sorry.
So you made 2 phone calls. First call was after you read the first article. Then you called him again after you read the second article.
It's all your fault, Grandpa.
It's your fault.
He's like,
I
why?
can't afford
Who
a
was
house.
that?
Yeah.
Who are you?
Also, I love that when we do the phone, we still do this. I'm like, I don't think I can.
Oh, well, you're
afford
calling your grandparents. So it's,
That's
a
true.
landline.
It's on a landline.
It's better than us doing like this.
But it'd be interesting to find out about people who didn't read the second article, or the ones who didn't read the first article, right? Because you read both of them, all right? So you had 2 perspectives, right? But it'd be interesting if you only read the one,
Yeah.
right, and those reasons made logical sense to you.
Yeah.
It's probably going to further, enforce some of your biases or your already existing opinion. Right. And you're going to think, you know what, the media's right. This article's correct. See, that's what I've been saying all this time. This is the problem.
Yeah.
Right.
But it comes from the perspective of each generation too. So for what I mean by that is that article on Facebook had 1,300 comments. A lot of Facebook users at the moment are older generation, right? So the average user on Facebook is 50, 60.
Is that right?
It is at the moment.
Yeah, wow.
So Facebook is where like...
Got to stop using it.
Well, no, it's...
That's why I don't use it.
It's still, you're getting close to that demo, Jace. But it is an older demographic that predominantly uses Facebook at the moment. I don't think the article was on TikTok, because if it was on TikTok, we might have had still as many comments, but it might have been a totally different conversation. It would have been interesting to see the balance, because I don't think it's fair for Gen X or Gen Z or Gen Y or whatever to blame boomers for all of their problems.
Just some of them.
Maybe just some. No.
Just the housing ones.
Just the housing. No. But But, obviously, I think a lot. I did read through some of the comments as well on Facebook, and it was like boomers standing up for themselves, which they are entitled to. But there were also some younger gens like standing up as well, and I think rightfully so. But it's just interesting to see, like, it is easy to place blame on everyone else, but really, like, let's look at it from their perspective. Like you said, like they worked hard, they built their home. For a lot of this generation, like, it's not like Gen Y, even Gen X now, or millennials, I should say, we move house like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times, whereas the boomer generation, they like built their home and they had a block and they may have a veggie patch and they grew up their families in these homes. It means so much to them, right? So to say, hey, you got to leave or you got to downsize, that maybe they don't want to. Like, you know what I mean? There's so much sentiment behind
and they
that.
They shouldn't have to either. I think it's grossly wrong to try and pressure
We can't force
older
anyone
generations,
out.
right? Trying to force people out and have older generations, make them almost feel guilty that they're living. There may be a husband and a wife, an older couple, where their kids have moved out, they've got grandkids, they might come once or twice a month, but there is 3 or 4 even spare bedrooms. It's unreasonable to then say you need to vacate that property, the house that you've lived in for 30 or 40 years, you've built with your family, you've got all your memories there. It's unreasonable to say you need to now move away to make room for a different generation. And the issue is, as you said, the inner, middle ring, 5 to 10 kilometres from the CBD. There is no first home buyer that's going to buy a $3 or $4 million property, because that's the value of those, particularly a house, right? A 4-bedroom house in Rozelle is not selling within the first home buyer.
Right? Like, so what Michael was saying, that the younger generation have moved many times. So, for example, it might be the thinking that if the boomers downsized and made their property available, someone else with a family of 4 who's living on the outer ring will then move in.
Yeah, maybe
and
it's
then someone that's a first home buyer might move into their property and so forth, right? So not necessarily the first home buyer buying the inner ring.
Well, I'll give
So
you
you
a
say
real,
it moves up.
Yeah,
I'll give you a real life
so there's
example.
like a trickle down effect.
Real life example.
Yeah.
The area I live in is getting expensive. It's probably quite expensive, right? Therefore, I live in a 3-bedroom townhouse.
Yeah.
Even though I would love the 4-bedroom house with a pool and a big backyard, I can't afford that in my neighbourhood. So I'm in the 3-bedroom townhouse. Could I move up to the 4-bedroom at the moment? No, but if there was more of that type of supply available, maybe the prices would be a little bit different. But even so, I don't think if there's all of a sudden 10 new 4-bedroom homes with pools that come up in my neighbourhood, I don't think that's necessarily going to drive prices down. It's just going to mean they don't go up as fast for that period of time, because maybe there's a bit more supply and a bit less demand. But this doesn't solve the issue unless developers are coming in, buying them all, buying a row and building apartments, and more people can move. It doesn't really solve the issue. It's definitely not a long-term solution. So I don't really understand where that rhetoric comes from. Like, let's force these people out. So it doesn't make sense to me.
From memory, doesn't this whole generational war come from a boomer making some sort of comment criticizing the younger generation about that?
Back in my day, I didn't go out for coffees.
It was so much more difficult, and I think that's where it all started. It's not as if
It definitely comes from both sides. It's not like it's just the younger generation sitting there saying,
But I wonder what the trigger was. Like the very first cause of the beginning of this debate, right?
But there's 2 things, right? If a boomer says, because some of the comments on that post on Facebook, there was a beautiful comment which was like, and you know what, next generations, if you work hard and save and build your house for your whole life, then you too can one day do whatever you want with it, right? Which is true, right?
Yeah.
But I think the
I think it was like you two can have empty bedrooms one day or something like that. But I was like, that's kind of morbid.
The angst from younger generations comes from, hey, like, it's probably harder for us to do that.
Yeah.
But in saying that, why are we like, if boomers are they're living through the situations they had tough times. They may have bought property for $10 back in the day, but it's not their fault that they lived through those times, and they should be able to be rewarded for the hard work as well.
Talking on their fault, and that's where I think the younger generations, not attacking, but saying it's the boomers' fault, I think it's misguided. I think as a boomer who's bought their house, worked hard, owns their house, maybe has some spare bedrooms, to then say they need to be kicked out, I think that is misguided. I think there's other failings within the market that have occurred, which have led to the fact that there are $10 million properties within that $5 million ring, and people can't afford to stay within that ring.
Yeah. Well,
I think there's wider issues, not just boomers not selling their house.
Yeah.
What are some, do you reckon, some of those wider
Look,
issues?
the most obvious one comes from government. And, we've talked about the housing supply issue extensively on the pod. We've talked about some of the regulation side of things and freeing up, with what Chris Minns is doing and freeing up housing supply. But that housing supply backlog, it's not something that's just come overnight. It's been years in the making, probably decades in the making, where you've had difficulty getting things approved, difficulty getting projects out of the ground and creating supply in well-located areas. And then that's led to people that have grown up in a particular area that will be forced to move out.
Yeah.
Like, take your kids, for example, where you live.
Yeah.
Are they going to be able to buy, in 15 years' time when they grow up, are they able to buy within that range?
I'm not sure how I bought in that range, so I don't know how they're going to do it. Like, it will be tough.
They'll have to move out
They'll
further,
have to move out.
unless there's a significant supply increase in that area to not drop prices. Drop prices won't happen, but to have less aggressive price growth. And the next best thing as someone buying for property not going up is to have stagnant growth, right? Because as time goes on, if it doesn't go up, then that's technically you're able to.
But doesn't that relate to, it might be the boomers' fault because they're also the NIMBYs? So
definitely
they're not in my backyard type,
so you look,
right?
So you look at an area like Balmain, which is like inner ring Sydney, like it's about a 4 or 5K, maybe closer to the city, the CBD, and most of that suburb is heritage listed, right? So if you have people that have, and whenever a property goes for sale in Balmain, the listing is always on realestate.com is always like first time for sale in 70 years or something ridiculous like that, right? So if you have just all of these homes that you can't knock down, you can't renovate, you can't build something else, you can't build duplex, you can't, like, it's just, there's 100 properties. It goes back to my bananas, right? There's 100 properties. Everyone wants to live in this suburb because it's so close to the city and it's so well located and it's beautiful and whatever. But not everyone that wants to be there can be there. Prices go up dramatically, and these are some of the issues, right?
Well, talking to your point specifically in Balmain, so a suburb here in New South Wales, that Leagues Club.
Oh yeah,
it's sat there vacant. It's been derelict for 10 years now, 15 years now, and they've tried to redevelop it, and that is one of the best located areas.
Premium location.
If you've grown up in the Balmain region and want to stay in the area as a 20-year-old, 25-year-old, if there was density in that location, for example, that could have been developed, that creates more housing supply, and it means that there is more bananas available in the market to purchase.
It goes back to what we say. So the next generation coming through, they can buy an apartment there in Rozelle, and then they can work their way up to the house in Balmain, and then they can have as many spare bedrooms as they like when they're older as well. The other thing on policy, policy is so true, man, because like, how can you, so one thing that we have here in Australia obviously is the age pension. And a lot of the boomers, so like the concept of super didn't come into play until like halfway through their careers. So it's not like our generation where we're getting part of our wage goes straight into super. It's forced saving for our retirement. They didn't have that for their entire careers. It was a new thing that was introduced. So so they rely on what's called the age pension, which we're all aware of, right? So if they sell their $5 million property in Northern Beaches and buy a $2 million apartment and they have $3 million profit, they don't get that they don't get the benefits anymore of the pension. So they don't want to relinquish. There's no incentive for them to relinquish that, because they say, well, and really they could probably live off the $3 million.
The counter to that is, well, you got $3 million.
Yeah, they could live off. No, they could, right? But why would they do that when the incentive's not there?
I agree.
So how can we force people out and say, hey, okay, yeah, now you're out on your own when we're kind of looking after you at the moment. You're out on your own now. They would never do it. So is there a change in that sort of policy as well that needs to come into play?
And the spare bedrooms, that, what's the definition of a spare bedroom? Because a lot of the grandparents look after their grandkids, right? People might stay over.
I saw one comment, they changed it to a sewing room.
I know, there was something. I've got a craft room now. I don't have a spare bedroom.
How do you define that?
Yeah, like it's probably looked at in the census, right? Like the ABS when the census was done.
How many bedrooms do you have?
And how many people live there. at that time, because the census is always at the time you're doing the census.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Like how many people are
How many
in
are
the
there?
home right now?
But it goes back to realestate.com, because when you look at a listing, it goes 4 bedroom, 2 bathroom. It doesn't say 2 bedroom, 1 sewing room, 1 gym room. Like, it doesn't-
Yeah,
you know what I
exactly
mean?
right.
So these are bedrooms by definition.
So that could be a misconception.
But how
right?
people use them, right? And
Yeah,
even like these
exactly.
family homes, like this, like for it might be 2 people living there, but this is where the families, the grandkids and the kids, they come back and they get together and they have the family dinners or they have parties or whatever. Like this is where the families come back to be together.
And
Yeah,
to
100%.
take
It's hard
that
to-
away from a family, you know, like that's a beautiful thing to have.
How do you say go to a 2-bedroom apartment?
Yeah.
You like. Then it's like, okay, can we all fit in the dining room? For some of
Yeah.
these families, it's impossible to do
Exactly.
that.
And no market works perfectly as well. There's not going to be like there's 1,000 spare bedrooms. That means we can fit 1,000.
Yeah, that's
more
right.
No market works that way. So
Yeah.
there's always going to
No.
be spare bedrooms. There's always going to be the other scenario where there's a 2-bedroom house with 4 or 5 people living in there. So
Yeah.
no market works perfectly
So,
as well.
but let's say all the boomers moved, they all downsized for some reason, all of them. Does that actually, like, it does help supply, but does that actually fix the problem? Because like you said, who's going to be able to afford the $5 million home
No,
in the inner ring?
I think the implication that if all these retirees with spare bedrooms downsized to, you know, a 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom apartment to solve the housing crisis, like that as the answer to the housing crisis is just completely untrue. Like that makes no sense to me at all to be a solution. I think what you're saying about, you know, government policy, like that missing middle that we spoke about, lack of medium density housing, zoning laws that you referenced, Chris, like these are the issues that are contributing to the housing crisis. It's not grandma and grandpa with a craft room and space for their grandkids to stay 2 nights a week that is going to solve the housing crisis.
It might be such an Australian thing as well, because like I just think like you look at every American sitcom that I watch, and say like they live in New York, one of the boroughs, and they all move to Florida when they get to a certain age.
they have massive houses too.
We don't really have that. We don't. I mean, there's you know, some people move to the Gold Coast maybe, but we don't have that mass migration of the older generation like they do over there. It's just not a thing here.
I just think the reality. I think it's misguided because I just think the reality of the groups that are calling for boomers to sell their places, where it's a 4 or 5-bedroom house, the groups that are calling for that are probably the ones that can't actually afford. The ones with the young families, those higher end properties, are the ones that probably can't afford to get those properties anyway. So I hear your point on that, Jace, but I just don't believe that the groups that are calling for the boomers to sell up their places are not the ones that can afford those properties in any case.
Yeah.
And then coming back to policy, there's also another massive disincentive for people to downsize, and it's something called stamp duty. So stamp duty, whenever you purchase a property, you need to pay stamp duty. Now, again, you talk about the boomers who are probably asset rich, but a lot of the time cash poor.
Yep.
So they've got a large asset, which is fine. But for them to buy that new property, they need the deposit, and then they need stamp duty, which is a cost that you don't recoup, or it's not equity into the property. So these are also barriers for them to downsize. So there's also, it's another policy where stamp duty is a limiting factor or a barrier for anyone, whether you're downsized or not, but to purchase that property to downsize.
So what policies would need to change? Actually, but the actual question is, do policies need to change?
Well,
do we need to see downsizes at scale? I don't know if that's something we actually need.
It might not be a policy of encouraging downsizes at scale, but I think the focus on property as a wealth creation tool and that obsession, and you mentioned earlier, Michael, about it's an Australian thing, but I think the Australian psyche is more like the focus on property for your wealth is just so consuming and so overpowering that property, owning 3-4 investment properties is the way to set myself up for retirement. It's not, I should salary sacrifice into my super when I start working at 21.
Not as sexy.
And correct. And by the time I'm 50, I'll have $3 million in my super. It's how do I buy 3-4 properties? And there's some policies that the government has implemented to restrict the lending so that it makes it more difficult for someone to go and borrow money to buy their 5th or 6th property. But there's still a massive focus on that, and negative gearing. right, is the one that every government talks about, but no government has the courage to actually do something about it.
I thought you were going to say something else.
I was thinking about it, right? But
negative gearing. Explain that to me.
That's a massive one. Yeah.
Right. So that's the one where you get
Simpleton.
a tax break and there's a tax incentive for owning an investment property.
Okay.
So, for example, if you're losing money on that property, right, you actually get that loss to reduce the tax you pay.
Okay.
So
so losing money, for example, like, can you just break that down?
Yeah. So for example, if you own an investment property and the rent you collect is $20,000, but the interest on the loan, the upkeep of the property, the council rates and everything else is $30,000, right?
Okay.
So in a year, you've lost $10,000.
You're in the red.
You're in the red on that property.
Got it.
But because of that, you'll end up paying less tax because they take $10,000 off your taxable income from, say, your salary.
Okay.
Right? So if you earn $90,000 a year, instead of taxing you at $90,000, because you lost that $10,000, you're now paying tax of someone who's earning $80,000 a year.
Okay.
So you're paying less tax. So in other
Makes
words,
sense.
the government's subsidising
Your loss.
your loss.
Yeah.
Correct.
Right.
And the other big thing to that is you've been paying tax throughout your whole year. If you're working, PAYG job, you've been paying tax on that 90 grand salary, and then when it comes tax time, because
You
it's
get
an
a whole
$80,000
You get money
salary,
back.
you get money back. So there's
that's
massive
right.
tax breaks.
Free money.
And
kind of.
the
Sounds like
issue with that, the issue with negative gearing is when you make a loss on other assets, you're generally only allowed to offset that loss against similar losses. Whereas with property, you can offset that against your salary.
Okay.
So if you make a business loss, you generally can't claim that off. And this is not tax advice, but you generally can't claim that off your salary. So that's a big implication. So that's where I agree with what Jason's saying, that property has become this wealth generating investment. It's not seen as shelter and a necessity for a lot of people, which is a massive problem.
There's no limit on it either. So with super,
Correct.
once you get to that $3 million, if you get to that $3 million,
I'm like, sorry,
I was
is
going to say
anyone near
once,
that?
hold on.
Jeez.
If you get to $3 million, then the tax implications change in your in
that's
super.
right.
Whereas with property, there's no limit on, you can buy 100 properties if you have the capacity to do so. There's no real limit. There's no real huge, massive limitations on that.
That's right. That's exactly right. And that point about property is not seen as shelter, right? Because
like it's a fundamental
For
right.
example,
to have
I
housing.
think-
Is it an asset or is it shelter? Because so is it a basic human need?
Yeah.
Yes, the answer is yes to that. But then you've got this ability to invest in that basic human need, which then makes that need so unobtainable
Yeah.
for the people that need it.
Yeah.
And that's where we're seeing, that to me is where we see
Yeah.
ourselves right now in this generational issue. And it's become worse and worse over the years, and it's only going to get worse until it's addressed.
correct. And that demand for property is what drives the prices of property up.
Right.
So it's not boomers' fault; it's investors' fault. Is that what you're saying?
No, I think
I'll
there's,
try to get
there's several policy, and
Yeah,
I think there's
correct.
a lot of policy issues.
So I think the common theme is government policy, right?
Yeah.
Like what you said earlier, even if all the boomers downsized and sold their property, is that a drop in the ocean of solving the problem? Or is that actually going to make a significant difference? And I think from the previous episodes, we're talking about inflation, all these macro things that actually influence approvals, developments, right? These are the macro things that can actually have an impact on the trajectory of the prices of property, not just a couple in their 60s selling their house and moving into an apartment is not necessarily going to impact and solve the housing affordability issue.
If you've enjoyed what you've seen so far, make sure to check out Property Now on all our channels, where we post exclusive behind-the-scenes content and deep dives into certain topics that don't make it in the full episode. I think on the policy thing as well, an interesting thing I picked up in this second article was that a comment they made to kind of defend baby boomers was that, most of the policymakers in Australia are Gen X and millennials. So if the issue, and it kind of sounds like we're all agreeing on the issue being bad policy, poor policy, or, just policies that is not addressing the problem, if that's all coming from, the younger generations, it's not coming from the baby boomers predominantly. They're not setting these policies. So it's kind of, shifting that blame again to now it's millennials' fault.
Oh, they did set the original policies, so they brought things into
That's
place.
true.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but it is up to new
to change,
to
or
make the change.
adapt.
Yeah, that's
and
correct.
And I think that's the key. It's the adapt. I mean, you can't blame someone for 20 years ago putting a policy and the effects
But it was right for
now,
20 years ago, perhaps.
Yeah, but
so
the
we
effects that
gotta-
are happening right now,
Yeah.
I think we need to address it. And it will be addressed. There's going to be some policy changes. There has to be. And we're seeing early makings of this. But the issue is, I mean, with government, it needs to be, they need to want to make the change.
Well, there all goes back to the fact that a lot of the changes that need to be made are probably not going to be popular changes at the moment. Because if you currently are investing in property and they say, oh, hey, we're going to get rid of negative gearing, we're going to get rid of that, you'd probably go, oh man, this sucks. Like,
it's a brave politician
It's
that
gonna
takes
be
that on,
brave,
but
yeah.
it will be taken on
yeah.
when it's seen to be popular. It's very simple. So they'll need to be, we've talked about this previously as well, but they'll need to be voted in on the back of this policy being pushed through, and it's a popular, and that will happen as the generation goes through. As we get older, and the generation that we're currently in still can't achieve home ownership.
Yeah.
It will have to change, because the popular policy will be, we need to remove all these barriers that have stopped us from owning houses for so long.
Does media have a role to play in that? Because if the
Media
media
always has
pushes
a
an
role.
agenda, yeah, like so.
I mean, I think I really like what the Sydney Morning Herald have done. I mean, they
Yeah.
haven't just painted one side. I think they've given both sides. If you've read both of the articles,
Yeah.
they've given both sides, which I actually really like.
Yeah.
So it's a balanced view, to your point, media absolutely has a role to play. Media is the voice to raise concerns and raise issues, and I think they've done that and had a balanced view, which I think is a great outcome, but there needs to be change made.
Yeah. And I think the third article that they should come out with, which I think they already do,
Here we go.
is that there are regular articles that Sydney Morning Herald writes about in terms of how government policy is affecting the housing affordability issue.
So maybe the generation should unite
Yeah.
and push for government policy.
Yeah,
protest.
100%.
Yeah, but they absolutely should,
Yeah.
because again, I talk on the generation. You want your kids to probably live, like if they're not going to move overseas or whatnot, you probably want it, and they're going to stay within the area, you probably want them to stay close to you, right? Do you want them to move 2 hours away? So if you want your kids to stay close to you and you want them to be around, there needs to be more supply in the area
It's not even only that. It's, do you want your kids to be able to afford property?
to buy property.
Do you
Yeah.
want your otherwise we're not going to have any spare bedrooms because our kids are going to still be with us,
Yeah.
So yeah, changes certainly need to be made. I just can't believe that 4 millennials/zillennials, sorry Zaz, you're a bit younger than us, are all agreeing that the boomers are okay. It's not all their fault. Like, this is actually, we talk about different things from a different angle here all the time, but this is very
See,
very
yeah, I
interesting.
think it's not their fault, but I also understand the anger coming from the
Yeah.
younger generations, because
they can't
it's
do
becoming unachievable.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so there's multiple failings over the last few decades that have led to the situation that we're in now. So I don't think it's any generation's fault in particular, and I agree with what you're saying. They need to unite to fix the issue.
But that's where the tension comes from, because the boomers go, no, just work hard. And it's like, well, we are working hard. we
Yeah.
are doing that.
Yeah.
But then the other side of that is, I guess they didn't have, like, these homes that the boomers bought for $10. I keep exaggerating greatly, but they didn't have air conditioning and 90-inch televisions and all these other knickknacks. So that's another statement that comes out a lot, Our cost of living has gone up for us, but we're also buying a lot more things, I think. So times have changed, and we've got to change with the times, I think, is probably from a policy perspective.
Yeah,
is the
exactly
key.
right. Exactly right.
I think that's a big one, the policy side of things, removing some of the barriers that are stopping people from selling, moving, buying, and
Yeah.
creating supply.
That's
We
right.
always talk about that. We harp on supply.
And that point about policies that were implemented many decades ago may have been right at that time, but now it's not suitable.
Yeah.
And what that makes me think about is stamp duty.
Yeah.
Because from what I understand, stamp duty was introduced as like a tax on the wealthy, right? So that if you are buying a more expensive property, because stamp duty goes up in a scale, right? So it's not a fixed tax.
Yeah.
So the more expensive the property price is, the more stamp duty you should pay, right? So that goes towards trying to create equality, right? So if you can afford to buy a really expensive property 50 years ago, you should be paying more stamp duty than someone else buying a property that's cheaper.
And is it state-based as well?
It is,
Yeah.
yeah. But it all work about the same, and,
Yeah.
and they all work around the same rates. But now stamp duty is like one of those legacy taxes
Yeah.
that's just stayed around,
It needs to be reviewed.
and it doesn't serve its function anymore, right?
Completely
Yeah.
doesn't. And there's multiple taxes that need to be reviewed. That's another topic. But stamp duty is one of those taxes which absolutely needs to be reviewed,
Yeah.
because as property prices have gone up,
Yeah.
the stamp duty amount has gone up, and then that also creates a disincentive for state governments to want to level out prices or not bring prices down, but it's in the government's interest for prices to keep going up forever if they're getting a percentage.
That's right.
They're getting a clip of the ticket percentage.
That's right.
But there is an
off every property sale.
There is an alternative, right? So they're talking about the not land tax. What is it?
That was removed.
So so that came in for like 6 months where you pay an ongoing land tax rather than an upfront for your stamp
That's just about New South Wales.
Yeah.
That was Dominic Perrottet brought that in and it's been removed.
So that's been removed.
So that's gone. Yeah. As soon as the change of government in New South Wales happened, that was the first thing to go.
So Dom Perrottet, millennial, one of the first millennial leaders in New South Wales, trying to make change. And it was removed. Why? Because it's like not a popular thing, or because new government
Well, there's an argument that because
duty.
if you're going to pay land tax every year, you're probably better off just paying a one-off lump sum of stamp duty because it's going to cost you more based on how long you're going to live in the property, right?
But that depends, again, this is a whole nother tangent. That depends on how long you're going to live
Correct.
If our
exactly
generations are moving more,
spot on,
then, I think
exactly
I heard a lot of brokers talk about, hey, I think it was like a 14-year period where if you're going to move before 14 years, you're better off paying this land tax.
Yeah, that's right. It depends on the situation, and also it made affordability better.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden, if you buy $1 million property in New South Wales, your stamp duty cost is about $40,000. So you'll need that in your deposit.
Yeah.
One thing I think is interesting, was it adjusted for CPI?
Oh, yeah, it would be. Yeah. It's like land tax. Land tax is
Chris,
adjusted.
they got rid of it.
What's CPI?
So inflation. So it was adjusted for inflation.
Wait,
so
what does that stand for though? Like CPI?
Consumer Price Index.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's interesting though, because it would have been adjusted. So what that means is if there's an inflation rate of 7% in this year, then whatever you're paying would go up by 7%. So it probably would have worked out quite bad for a lot of people.
Yeah. So actually, I don't know if it's adjusted to inflation, but it's probably adjusted to the land value, right? Because land tax will be based on the land value. So the value of the land going up,
gotcha.
just like all the other land taxes, right? So again, same thing, right? With what you're talking about is that as the land value appreciates, you'll be paying more land tax.
Correct.
Right. But it did reduce 100% the barrier to entry for first home buyers. Yeah.
I just think between a lot of the stakeholders, there is a disincentive to want prices to reduce.
Yeah, that's right.
There is, but then there's gonna be this inflection point where they realise that there's a whole generation that cannot purchase, that cannot buy, and what are the implications of that? I think that has much more serious implications. Forget the investment side from a shelter point of view and from actually having a bloody home point of view. I think that's going to be the biggest implication. That will take time for politicians and government to realise, but I think as the new generation of politician comes through, let's hope that they have this mind on, because housing is one of the biggest issues and a generational issue that needs to be addressed, not from the investment point, but from the shelter point.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. But it'll take a lot of courage to do that, so...
Chris for Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. There's your next venture.
One venture is enough.
I'll vote for you. Yeah, but I think that's a good, and if you can't afford housing, this younger generation, if they can't afford housing in these areas close to the great work opportunities, good schools, good education opportunities, hospitals, all this sort of stuff, then there are those other implications as well.
Absolutely.
Like the work opportunities are harder to come by, and they might not be able to achieve what they want to in that regard. So it's important.
And then there's issues so you've got these great schools and these great hospitals, but the teachers and the nurses can't afford to live there.
Yeah.
So
they have to travel for work.
It affects everything.
Yeah.
I guess that's why we can't say it is one generation's fault or there's one reason for all of this. There's multiple reasons and it affects multiple things, and we've got to look at the whole thing as a whole symbiotic ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think the baby boomers have played within the rules that have been set for them by government. I think now the existing generation is trying to play within that same set of rules, and they can't, which is understandable because it's just not relevant anymore. So I think there needs to be a review of a lot of the legislation.
Yeah,
it needs to
that's
be.
right. And I think the foreign buyers would be able to relate to what the baby boomers are feeling, because sometimes they're isolated as a group, being responsible for adding to the price pressures. Right? It's all the foreign buyers that's buying up all the properties, people from overseas. Hence why property prices have gone up. But again, it's not necessarily the case.
It's like
right?
it's everyone's fault but mine, right? It's everyone else's fault. It's not like, like
Exactly.
true.
And I think these policy changes, is it possible, this might be a stupid question, but is it possible to have a policy change that is going to benefit one generation, say the younger generation that can't buy houses, and not hurt the baby boomers? Do you know what I mean by that? Is a policy change that's required going to mess with this baby boomer generation? Is it going to push them out of houses? And is that the only way to then open things up for a generation that's facing different issues?
Look, it depends how it's drafted
Yeah.
and brought into legislation, but there are ways to.
Nobody wants something to nobody's going to back a policy if it's going to
Well,
hurt
that's a
them.
lot of the politicians have properties,
Yeah.
and they're probably utilising the negative
Yeah.
gearing side of
Yeah,
things.
that's exactly right.
Right, but there are ways where there could be, it's not retrospective, it's going forward. So when capital gains tax was brought in, it was anything, I think it was 1985, where the rules didn't apply, for example. If you bought the property...
grandfathering, is that what they call it?
Yeah, grandfathering, right? So if you bought your property when the laws came in place, that was the line in the sand, and anything going forward, the new rules apply. So there are ways to make it fair and equitable, but I think it does need some clever policy and some clever thinking, but it needs to, the mind, I really like what you said, Jace, the mindset needs to shift from property is this, it's not looked at with a bit of emotion. I think there needs to be a bit of emotion brought into property, that people are raising families, it's shelter, it provides security without the investment piece to it. I think that's a really good point. And that's the message I think we should send back, that it's not just what's the yield, what's this investment side of things on the property. Keep that in the commercial property world, right? But residential property, it's for living, it's for shelter, it's people's homes.
Yeah,
That's
it's
right.
a roof
Raise a
over
family.
your head.
Yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
security. It's
Because at the moment, I think it lacks a bit of balance, is that property is the only way for wealth creation.
What else do you invest in, Jace?
Right. Well, you can invest in shares. I think you mentioned one of your friends,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The parents invested
Yep.
in shares, so she's invested in shares. So and I'm pretty sure if the parents are very pro-property, she might have been pro-property as
100%.
well,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
But you can invest in shares,
Crypto.
crypto,
Business.
bonds,
this is not
business,
advice.
right? Salary
No.
sacrifice.
I'm just
to
saying,
your
what are the
super.
other investment
Yeah, yeah,
classes?
no,
What
plenty.
else can you invest? It's like,
Yeah, heaps of stuff. It's not as if property is the only vehicle for wealth. It's one of the vehicles. It may suit someone,
And it's
but
probably seen as the biggest one, I think, if
correct.
you
But
listen
by
to the media.
default, like a lot of
yeah.
people, if you're having a barbecue, if you're having a chat, talking about investment, I think 8 out of 10 times it's property, because property is kind of seen as the stable.
What's the Aussie
investment
dream?
asset.
And things have just continuously got bigger, like the prices. But like, is it? It's not. It's the least liquid of all the investments.
Yeah,
as well.
correct.
So like, we look at these boomers that have these $5 million.
That's because of stamp
properties.
duty, right?
Yeah, and it's not like they can go and spend the $5 million elsewhere. I mean, they can use equity, but then there's whatever. But they don't have $5 million in the bank in their pocket. Whereas if
Correct.
they had $5 million in shares, they could sell down today.
Yeah,
Live off the
And
dividends,
live
yeah.
off that. So it meant what is wealth at the end of the day? This is like a much grander question. Like, what is wealth? Is it having the $5 million house and eventually that gets passed on to your children or what have you?
Yeah.
Or is it being able to like have the cash and spend it now and do what you want?
Yeah,
It's-
that's right. So I think the psyche has to be, it's not one is better, shares is better than property. I mean, that debate is always ongoing, but it's more around having the consumers think about that.
Yeah.
Right. It's
Just
not
getting
by
all those
default,
thoughts.
it's property.
But again, I think that negative gearing is such a big implication for
Yeah.
property. So let's talk on two different investment types, shares and property. If you have an investment property and you make that loss, so you make a $10,000 loss and you can offset that against your income. If you make a $10,000 loss in shares, you can't offset that against your income. So there's already a weighting to favour property because of the tax breaks that you achieve for negative gearing.
Yeah.
So Zaz, let me dig into that a little bit. So let's say you have $50,000 in shares and they end up selling all those shares for $40,000. So you've made a loss of $10,000.
Yeah.
That if you then make a profit elsewhere, you can't offset that loss against that profit. If you make a profit in shares, you can offset that profit in the share side of things. So that same asset class. You can't then take that share loss and offset that against your 90 grand income like you can in property. That there is a massive incentive to create property as an investment vehicle.
Yeah.
So what happens if they get rid of negative gearing?
Well, they wouldn't
This
have
is
that.
a massive question.
They wouldn't have that incentive anymore.
Right.
So people.
So would people invest less in property?
You've heard of so there's positive gearing as well, right?
Yes.
Yes.
So, which you get, right? So
Yeah,
if
I
you
think so.
negative gearing is when the amount of money you make from the property is less than the money that
Yeah.
you're spending to keep the property. And positive gearing
It's
is
the other way.
you make more, you actually make a profit
I
from
have
that.
heard people say
Yeah.
my
Which
property
with
is
where
positively
rates are-
geared. And I've gone,
But
very
so
good.
from a so if you look at property investing as a business, right? If you own a business that manufactures chairs that we're sitting on,
Squeaky chairs.
and we're selling these squeaky chairs, right? Then as a business, you want to make money. But in property, if you're a property investor, there's actually a benefit in losing money, which is ridiculous anyway in the long term. Like in the long term, as an investor, you want positive geared properties, but there's an incentive to lose money. So you renovate, and then there's tax benefits on the new kitchen that you've put in as well, because you can depreciate that over time. There's all of these benefits from a tax perspective.
Right.
So if you take
but
those,
that doesn't exist in other.
doesn't exist anywhere
assets.
else.
Well, it does, but you can't offset it against
Yeah.
your normal income. And some of the time, it's not necessarily you're
I'm with
making
you
a
now.
cash loss. It could be
Yeah.
depreciation, which is
Yes.
a non-cash
Exactly.
loss. So then you may actually be flat, but because of the depreciation side of things, you can claim a loss.
So there's been and this is like there's been financial advisors in the past. I don't know if financial advisors do this anymore, but certainly generations ago, where they'd say, you should buy another property so that you can be negatively geared. And like being negatively geared was is a positive thing, because at tax time, hey, I get 10 grand back. Like that's great.
Because you're paying too much tax.
But you get that money back because you
Right.
paid tax in the first. But the
ridiculous.
ridiculous.
long-term plan with that is you accumulate 5 properties over a 10-year period, and then in 20 years' time, yes, it's negative geared, but your salary is still growing over that period, but the capital appreciation on the properties, it's just like a piggy bank. But then you get this massive capital increase on the properties, and then all of a sudden in 20 years' time, each property's gone from 500 grand to, who knows, probably 2 million these days. And you've managed to gain all this capital income, you've saved tax along the way.
Yeah.
It's seen as a really good... So my point is, the government policy allows you to do this. And this is where the baby boomer conversation is coming. They're playing within the rules, because that's what the rules stipulate you can do.
Yeah.
But the baby boomers aren't necessarily...
They're not all doing that.
They're not like this is their family. They might have their one family home that they've grown their family up in. They've got the veggie patch out the back, beautiful block of land, maybe an older style house.
So, but is that the only baby boomer demographic? Maybe there's the baby boomer that has that,
There might
but
be
also
others.
has the
Yeah.
other 6 investment properties.
There might be.
Are we talking about that?
Yeah, but
Yeah.
we always think about the landlord that's upping my rent. We think about them as baby boomers, but they're not. Like more investors are probably a bit younger, to be fair. So much. I didn't realize
Yeah, I think
there's
the
so much to unpack
implication
here.
that all baby boomers have done really well off property, or have like a big property portfolio. Like I know, again, linking it back to my grandparents, that's definitely not the case. They've got their very humble, beautiful little home on the top of a mountain in like remote Queensland, and they're both on the pension, and I wouldn't say they're wealthy in assets. They're wealthy in a lot of other things, love and joy, and they're both very healthy. So they've got a great life, but they're not sitting there on a pile by any means at all.
They've built up to that asset.
Yeah.
Or in some other cases, they've held the asset for such a long time.
Yeah,
So-
exactly.
And this is really like guilt tripping
Yeah.
them to
Yeah.
sell their property.
Yeah,
it's
no
not.
way.
It's not the answer. It can't be the
No.
answer.
I
We
agree.
shouldn't be encouraging that rhetoric to be talking like that, because that's not the answer to the problems that generations are facing today to get into home ownership. There's government issues, there's policy issues, there's a whole mindset issue that needs to shift.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And shifting from property as an investment. So I'm going to go residential property is an investment. Shifting it back to it's a basic need. It's bloody shelter. Everyone needs to have a roof over their
Yeah.
head.
Totally. It's so important to have that shift.
It needs to shift.
And for a lot of people, they don't have the luxury of looking at property as an investment. They're not even in that position where they could say, I'm growing my wealth. This is my property portfolio. It is just they need a roof over their head.
On the other side too, I don't think we can deter investors, because
We
there is a
can't.
need.
No.
There is a market that needs to rent or would
course.
start off renting. So there
Yeah.
still needs to be people that invest in property
Yeah.
to so that we have these rental
I
properties.
just think
out
it
in
needs
the
to be
market.
weighed up,
It needs
because
to be
the
weighed.
investors get this great tax benefit, but everyone else doesn't. So I think it needs to be weighed up, because investors are very important in the cycle. We've talked about that as well.
Yeah.
They provide rental stock, and that's a we know the rental crisis, but we know that having investors is a big piece.
And that's the other thing too, right? So if you can negatively gear in an investment property, why can't you negatively gear in your principal place of residence? Or is there another version of
There's
that?
no income.
Yeah, I know, but like it's costing me money. Like it's just there's maybe some thinking around that. I don't know what it is. I've never actually thought about it. But like, you know, I spend X amount of dollars on my mortgage every month. Why can't I offset that somewhere like an investor can?
I don't think there's any magical response that can come up short. I think it's looking at each item line by line and working out a plan. So start with stamp duty. It's just like they've got these caps that, you know, up to $850. Like, can we look at something better?
So Chris, what do we need to look at? Stamp duty? Negatively gearing? Like, what are the things? Like,
so stamp duty, negative gearing is definitely one.
Yeah.
I mean, they're working on the housing supply side. I think that needs to continue. That's a continuous change that they need to work on. So they're the three main points that they need to fix up. I mean, government had a history of building a lot more affordable and social housing in the past. I think government should be looking at doing that. They are now with Housing Australia and some of the community housing providers, which do an amazing job with managing and delivering affordable and social housing. I think there's actually some unsung heroes in the community housing sector, community housing providers that are really creating some good outcomes. So I think they're really the four main areas. But removing barriers and stamp duty, to me, is the one where you start at. It has to be the one. But that will involve federal and the states, of course.
Yeah.
That's where they got to start.
That's where they got to start. Well, that's good. That's a good, I think that might be a good
where
spot
we end.
to end. Yeah, end at the beginning. I love that. Full circle. This is such a big topic, and I feel like I have like 10 million other thoughts racing through my head. So I think we're going to need to do a part 2 generational debate divide because there's so much more to dig into. Before we wrap up, any final thoughts on, you know, whether it was those articles, what we've discussed today in terms of policy, anything from the panel, from my guys?
Great. Look, they're great articles. I
Yeah.
enjoyed reading them. So I assume we're going to put the links in the show notes for anyone else that wants to read them and get up to speed.
Maybe I'll put some of our favorite comments on our Instagram page.
That's awesome.
Actually, I've screenshotted a few. I've got them in the archives. So yeah, that could be a good Instagram post.
Nothing else to say. Like, Grandpa, you stay in that house.
Yeah,
like,
don't move.
Yeah, we love you.
I want to see. I want to see some comments come back to us on what they think, and I want to see the generations unite to fix the problem, rather than blaming each other. Let's actually see what the issues are, unite, and let's start. Actually,
blaming
trying to
each
fix
other
this
hasn't
problem.
worked, so let's try something.
It doesn't
different.
address the issue, right?
We can all have smashed Avo. Let's all have breakfast.
Let's all hold hands
let's,
and sing
discuss.
Kumbaya. Love it. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Zaz.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Property Now. If you haven't checked us out on social media yet, make sure you do. Have a look at our Instagram because we post a lot of interesting content from that week's episode. And make sure you drop any thoughts or feedback you have in the comments because we would love to hear from you. See you next week. The Property Now podcast offers opinions on Australian property news for informational and entertainment purposes only, and they are general in nature. It does not take into account your objectives, financial situation, or needs. It does not constitute professional advice. Always seek expert guidance before making any property-related decisions.